Welcome to the Tabletop SportCast. I'm your host, James Cast. Today is July 10th, 2024, and this is episode 168. Today we'll be doing a retrospective for my 1986 PGA mini season project. As always, if you'd like to reach out and ask any questions, talk about show topics, or just tell me about your latest project, you can send me an email at tabletopsportcast@gmail.com. Now, today we're going to do a retrospective on a recently completed project for me, and this is going to be how we're going to talk more about project management is through like real life examples. Probably do less episodes going forward, talking about some specific like agile concepts or project management techniques, but I thought a great way to go over those in the future will be to just do some retrospectives from time to time on some of the key projects that I'm completing on my tabletop. So what we'll be doing this time around is talking about this PGA mini season project that I just recently completed, and it was my quarterly project for Q2. Before we get into that, we'll do a recap of the tabletop and also talk a little bit about how my Q3 planning went, as I've recently been able to complete that as well. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about the week that was on the tabletop. And probably this time, let's talk more about the month that was, because it's been a while since we had a chance to really catch up on the tabletop. And if you're getting a chance to watch this on YouTube, you'll also have an opportunity to just check out as I share some of the information that we're being presenting. Like for right now, we're looking at the gaming log and getting a look at that. So this will be one of the first episodes that I post to YouTube. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the episode. So among the, first off, of course, if you want to keep track of everything that's happening from my tabletop, head on over to facebook.com/tabletop SportCast. I try to post a few times a week. Pretty quiet last week as I was completing my quarterly planning and really getting over COVID. I think I shared on my last post that had COVID after Play.con, knocked me down for a couple of days. Wasn't too bad, so lucked out there, but certainly forced me to lay low for a few days. And then also had some family vacation time, and so far the quarterly planning has worked out well in terms of falling during vacations, which gives me a chance to kind of do some reflecting on how the projects are going. In this case, I did have enough downtime ahead of time to be able to do most of my planning before going away, so I was able to just enjoy a couple of days off. So before we get into actually what kind of recapped, let's take a look at some of those key metrics. And as you can see now, 46 games have made it to my tabletop so far this year. So pretty good, really, overall, that a good mix of games have made it to the tabletop. And 292 gaming sessions completed here in almost like mid-July. So tracking a little shorter than or a little less than what I had last year. I was certainly averaging closer to like 55, 60 games per sessions per month last year. This year, just under 50. So playing a lot less games this year, which I think I kind of expected to a degree. And a lot of this has to do with some of the projects that I've been doing as well. A little short in terms of my green projects. Only 13 games have made it to the tabletop in the past 30 days. Only 18 have made it to the tabletop in the past 90 days. So really struggling to kind of keep a mix of games, which is partly because of playing less games as I go through things. But also 109 projects now complete for the year, as I was able to knock out a couple of projects here in June. And from a high level, we can talk about a couple of those. First and foremost, we had the Jacob deGrom versus Blake Snell 2018 project that went pretty well. And my final stats there were pretty close. First off, I was very surprised that the Mets really dominated the Rays from that 2018 season. I really expected the Rays are going to be the better team. Just turned out that, one, I think deGrom was a much better pitcher, even though they were both Cy Young Award winners, deGrom and Snell. deGrom's stats that year were just a touch better, and that showed during the course of the replay. He actually outperformed his stats, so maybe Tampa's team just a little weaker from the offensive standpoint. You can see here that deGrom finished my replay. They both went over on innings. deGrom went with a 1.49 ERA, whereas Snell had a 2.18. Still really good. Strikeouts, both. Well, actually, deGrom surpassed his total just barely. Probably a little bit lower strikeouts per 9, certainly for Snell as well. And then for WHIP, deGrom was well under. And Snell was pretty much on point there. And you can see their strikeout to walk ratios both a bit lower. I think in both of their cases, walks tend to happen a little bit more often than I would have expected. Tampa Bay didn't really hit the ball as well as New York did. So deGrom was able to keep his WHIP a little bit lower. Did have a no-hitter in one of the last sessions here. You can kind of see right here, game number 30, deGrom ended up pitching a no-hitter. He had just a great outing, actually gave up the one walk and had that batter erased. So ended up facing the minimum 27 batters. Really great. It was, the second no-hitter I've had this year on the tabletop, and just a great moment for the replay. deGrom had a number of double-digit strikeout performances. Snell had a couple. And I did use some of the new rule variants that allowed the ace pitchers. Both of these guys were full aces. deGrom was actually a full ace and full star, but allowed them to override any of the intangible charts. So they rarely, while they were pitching, they never went to the right now chart. They never went to the experience chart. They never went to the team chemistry chart. By preventing them from going there, they were able to control the action a lot more, and it led to a lot of really good outings for both of them. You can see overall, deGrom finished 15-7, Snell 6-13. Again, the Mets just outperformed them, I think because of the power that they had. I worked with the lineups. They basically used a set lineup for both teams, and what I allowed I think the advantage the Mets had is the Mets had a really broken roster in 2018. They had guys who did well during different parts of the season, but I think the lineup that I had is actually one that never probably could have happened for the team. I took advantage of the best players at different positions, and some of those the lineup configuration I had, I think, really never had a sustained presence for the Mets. There were some guys that were first half stars, some guys that were second half stars, and I kind of had them all together. So had a little bit of an advantage, and I think that put them over the top there. I also completed my New York Basketball Championship using the Blam set. I'm not really sure which teams were which, but what I had done here was basically just a single elimination tournament using Highlight Maker Hoops. This is like the express version of the game, not the full play. And it had Oyster Bay come out as my overall champion of that tournament. So that was a fun tournament too. Again, no expectations going in. Didn't really assign the rosters based on any relative strengths, so just worked out that Oyster Bay turned out to be that winning championship team there. And then, of course, there was a lot of activity for Play.con in the month of June, and a good number of games made it to the table. I think I recapped a lot of these already. I think the key ones there: Soccer Blast Express, Legends of Boxing, Let's Play in the new version, and some of the new games that are being some, playtesting games. So had a lot of fun at Play.con, and that was another big event for the month, as that helped me kind of wrap up like another cooperative event. You can see wrapped up my Squared Circle project. Did another historical replay, talked about that in the previous episode. And, the cooperative events, not too many more planned this year, even though that was the episode that we kind of rebroadcast last week as I took a break because of COVID. I think it's really good to try to organize some cooperative events, and it's something I'm thinking about trying to figure out for the second half of the year. So there might be more to come there, and we might talk about that in a future episode as well. But that was kind of why I shared that episode last week, was to start thinking a little bit more about, what I want to do in terms of some cooperative events for the second half of the year. The next one for me will be in August, as we do the Gridiron Games here in August, and really looking forward to that event. And we'll probably be doing more of a countdown to that over the next couple of weeks. As far as quarterly planning goes, you can kind of see where we are now. I decided to switch up my History Maker Baseball project. Decided to use the Cooperstown Classic set. And what I'm doing is using a lot of players who played for the Mets. In fact, all the players that I could find that played for the Mets, included them, and then grabbed a bunch of stars from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Pretty much went from like 1970 through roughly like 1994. There's a couple of guys who snuck in from beyond 94, but for the most part, it was just looking at those stars. And, mostly through my, age 24 year, and looking at the stars that I really kind of grew up watching. So made up some rosters. I got 6 rosters that I'm going to be working with and just doing like kind of a mini season there. My quarterly project for Q3 is the National League Lacrosse. It's going to be the 2012 season. I'm going to be using Lacrosse Blast Express to replay that season. The way I'm going to kind of go through that is through starting with the worst team, playing out their whole schedule, second worst team, playing the remaining schedule, and working my way down. The way their schedule worked that year is everybody played everybody twice. So that's what we're going to do, is recreate that schedule. And by the end, I'll just have the top 2 teams playing, and maybe they'll be down to seeing who's the champion is. And if I have time, I'll also play out the playoffs there too. So, National League Lacrosse is my quarterly project. This month, I'm not going to try to deliver anything across the finish line in terms of my monthly projects. Had to shuffle the deck a little bit here to kind of get things to fit in. Moved my NASCAR project back to the end of the year. It may even get pushed to next year. I should be able to complete my USFL project in August. The decathlon project got pushed back to September. And keeping track of these two, this one is actually going to switch out now, and I've actually, decided this is going to be a 2005 and 2006 NHL tournament is what I'm going to be playing here instead. So make that quick update live in a moment. And then we got Dodgeball this month. That'll be my fictional tournament. Got some breakaway football. Moved a couple of new games into the mix here, as I got some games during Play.con that I wanted to take advantage of. This one actually I had ordered beforehand, but breakaway football made it. And then this month's historical replay will be I'm going to replay the first game ever at Shea Stadium for the Mets. Going to be using Pocket Pennant Run for that, because it's great for just downloading and getting like the as-played lineups with their utility. So it works really well for recreating these kind of one-off games. All right, so that's kind of where we are with the quarterly planning. And, what I did this past week was I got caught up on a couple of projects. The the Grom project and the PGA tournament hadn't quite gotten across the finish line, so I used some of my time last week because the quarterly planning really turned out to be a little bit easier than I had originally anticipated. Most of these sets that you see me using here are all pre-printed. I really didn't have to print anything out to get to all of these. These are all existing sets that I already had. So there really wasn't anything to print. Everything was set up already. I just had to really organize a couple of tournaments. You can see I kind of set up like a couple of tournaments. Well, this is actually a different quarter, but set up a couple of different tournament screens and things like that. It was pretty easy to get through the planning, which left a little bit of time to get caught up on some of my gaming. Still a little bit behind, as you can see by my totals for the month, but feeling pretty good. So what I was able to do in the past week is just get, like I said, finish up that DeGrom vs. Snell project, finish up the PGA mini season, play a little bit of Stone Cold Hockey, which helped get that project going, and then started just in the past couple days really knocking out new sessions for July based on my July calendar. And speaking of which, this, as we wrap up kind of like this recap, this is what we have planned for July. And yeah, it's going to be a packed month. Got a lot of different activities in here. Looking forward to it. And a lot of like quicker play things. Other than maybe like, a couple of races, the decathlon events, and obviously some breakaway football. Those will probably be the longer ones that I have to get through. All right, that's kind of catches us up on the quarterly planning. So let's talk a little bit more about this retrospective on the 1986 PGA mini season. And of course, with every retrospective, what we want to do is talk about what went well first. And I think that what went well here was, one, deciding to do a mini season. I think if I had, again, you have to figure out like when do I go after large projects? When do I go after medium projects? When do I go after smaller projects? So this one turned out to be more on the smaller side. I decided to do a 10 event mini season. Now, playing History Maker Golf can be a little bit longer session, especially when you're playing more tournament mode. You're talking 2 to 3 hours to get through a session. So even though it was only 10 events, that's pretty much going to take me a few hours to get through each event. So when I decided to build the schedule, the way I kind of looked at it is, when you go through a PGA season, they don't play every single week. Yes, there's a tournament almost every week during the season, but a lot of the key performers don't show up every week. I wanted to make sure I included the 4 majors. That was going to be a given. And then I wanted to get a flavor for some of the other events that take place. So I decided to just include like 6 other events. And what I did is I kind of went through the PGA season. And I went through the PGA season and I decided that the best way to approach it would be to see what courses I had available that matched up with actual courses that were being played that year. So I went through all my play courses and tried to find as many matching ones as I could. And luckily, I have a lot of the courses at this point and was able to replicate a number of the key events. Then the only gaps that I had there were a couple of the majors, and we'll talk about those in some of the like what didn't go well. But ended up getting quite a few of the key events there, and this is the schedule that I ended up with. For those who are watching on YouTube, played the Hawaiian Open, which was Diamond Head, had the Hertz Bay Hill Classic, which was Ocean Knolls. Obviously, we had the Masters. We then had the Panasonic Las Vegas Invitational, which was at the Blackjack Golf Club. We had the Byron Nelson, the Memorial, the U.S. Open, and then the Anheuser-Busch Golf Classic, which was at Kings Mill. And we'll talk about these last two majors in a little bit too. So felt really good with being able to kind of like replay some of those key events. And then use tournament mode. And what was really cool was through the season, I saw some different storylines develop. Early in the season, Payne Stewart was just a force to be reckoned with. He, won one of the events. He finished in a tie at the end of the Masters, lost in the playoff to Craig Stadler. But, he was just showing up on the leaderboard every single time. And being one of the, one-rated golfers, you would expect that he was going to make the cut a lot and have a chance to be in those final pairings when I was doing the tournament mode. So, but then later in the season, he was struggling a bit. And I was having a hard time, getting him to keep up that consistency. So he started to fall off a little bit. One of the other storylines that developed was then Tom Kite, another one of the, one-rated golfers. And Tom Kite was making some cuts early on, playing okay, but then towards the middle of the schedule, he started to really perform well. He ended up winning, I think, 2 events, and really became more of a presence, in the second half of the schedule. So that was the second storyline that developed. Another one-rated golfer was Greg Norman, and Greg Norman had what you would kind of expect from Greg Norman, where I would have him be involved numbers of times, and he would just find ways of struggling and not really coming through in the clutch. And I think his best performance was probably at the PGA Championship, where he ended up tied at the end and lost in the playoff. But before that, it was just a struggle getting him to really, come through in some of the clutch moments. So that was kind of the third storyline. And then my fourth storyline was Andy Bean, who was kind of a surprise one to me. But again, another high performer for the season in terms of his rating. And he ends up winning both of the final 2 majors. Those are his only 2 wins for the season, but he wins both of the last 2 majors, the Open Championship and then the PGA Championship. So came on strong at the end and probably ends up winning my golfer of the year because of those 2 major wins. So yeah, it was really interesting. Had I think it was Gil Morgan who won the U.S. Open. As I said, Craig Stadler won the Masters, and then Andy Bean won the Open and the PGA Championships. So those are some of the things that went well. I felt like it, overall, I was really happy with the quality of the project. Now, what didn't go well so much? Well, first was having to fill in some courses. I was not able to get especially for those last 2 majors, I wasn't able to get the right courses. I didn't have the 2 courses that I needed to play the Open Championship that was actually played in 86, and then the PGA Championship course. So I filled in with ones that I felt were relatively close. Went through I was trying to stick to the play courses that I had available. And I ended up substituting in St. Andrews for that 1986 Open Championship, and then had Pumpkin Ridge, which felt like a good PGA Championship course, so I used that for the PGA. In retrospective, yeah, I think I would definitely want to, work on, how to make sure I had the full schedule. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The second thing that didn't really go so well, and this is part of my, fault for how I plan to do the project, but using the tournament mode for History Maker Golf. Now, tournament mode is great. I really love the mechanic of working through the tournament mode, trying to work through the rounds, get down to those final pairings. What I typically did with the tournament mode was made sure that I had 12 golfers on the course. So sometimes I went through like kind of my B plus finishers and determined like who would have been the next couple of pairings if I fell a little bit short. I think there was only like one or two times out of the 10 where I ended up with the right number of golfers at the end, and I had the full 12. Most of the time, I came up a little bit short in my pairings, so I was trying to like fill the gap a little bit with a couple of golfers. And I would look for, who shot in that, who got the dot for their final round, for their third round total from the B pluses, which gave me a smaller subset. And then from that subset, then I kind of, I worked on just like, rolling the decider dies until I had the right number of golfers to kind of fill the gap. The part that didn't play out well in terms of using tournament mode was it was really difficult to recreate who the actual winners were of those tournaments. So tournament mode, for the way History Maker Golf, and again, this is similar to how the History Maker engine works, right? Is it's more about creating your own storyline rather than creating a historical storyline. So, like, even if I think about like History Maker Baseball, like the game day chart works really well when you're trying to get some variance, but doesn't really help you with recreating like historical records. So that was, I would say, something that I struggled with a little bit in terms of using the tournament mode. And then the the last thing that I think didn't really go well is like tracking results. Like I don't think I was really set up well to track the results and figure out what I wanted to do. On the one hand, there was no need to keep like point totals. I wasn't going to do like a full season replay, so I didn't need to keep track of like everybody's points. So I think I simplified the work for myself by just saying like if they're not going to have a chance at playing around, I don't need to track anything about them. What I needed to do a little bit better job of was figuring out like how to track like my TFNs and things like that for some of those results that came up. So that's something I probably needed to work on a little bit better. And I think if I do this next time, I have to think about a better way to track some of those results and make sure that I know like how things ended up. I was struggling early on, like making sure like I knew what the real final totals were, adding like my third round scores and my final scores together. Just kind of got messy around that. But I think a lot of it was that I really didn't need that. I really only wanted to know like who won the tournament. So that was the key for me there. So what would I do differently next time? Well, I think the first thing that I would do differently next time would be to get those actual courses. And even if it means like I would have to sit down and actually create the courses, like I think for these last two, like I wanted to make sure that I had the right courses. And I probably should have made a little bit more of an effort to do that for a historical replay, to get these set up the right way. So I think that's the first thing that I would do differently is even if it meant I had to go through and like create the courses myself, I should have invested that time to make sure that I was set up to do that the right way. Obviously tracking TFNs, like setting up some kind of chart in here to just basically say, okay, what TFNs that I have? This way I knew if I needed them again, I would have them available. And there was only, I think, once that I missed on a TFN. So it wasn't like it was a major impact because a lot of times, one, I didn't have that many TFNs. I think I only had like 2 or 3 that came up during the entire 10 rounds or 10 tournaments that I played. And most of those didn't end up being like a repeat performer because most golfers don't make the cut more than once. So, but I think there was one time where I went back and I was like, oh, I should have had that. I missed on a TFN there. So that's something I would have liked to have done a better job of. The last one, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this one, is really setting it up like for a historical replay. So again, tournament mode works great, but it's to develop your own storylines. And if I wanted to replay like using the 1986 set, but getting my own sense of like how this tournament or how this season is going to play out, then tournament mode can work really well for that. But how would you go about doing that if you really wanted to do more of a historical replay? So in baseball, that's always easy, right? We can always use historical lineups or historical rosters to a degree. Like, what starting pitchers do I want? Like, you can have those options there. And sometimes that's worth doing, right? Sometimes you want to replay a season and be the manager. And, when it comes to baseball, you want to like make your own lineups too, right? So you have those advantages. What would you do for golf? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at like the 1986 US Open. Now, this was one of the events that I was really looking forward to in terms of this replay. I can remember, like, I was 16 when the U.S. Open was played at Shinnecock Hills. Growing up in Long Island, it was pretty cool that the U.S. Open was actually, coming to one of our local courses. Shinnecock is one of the courses that had been used over and over again at that point. And I remember because Ray Floyd was kind of a surprise winner of it, right? And my dad had actually had a chance to go and see the final day was actually on 18 when Floyd won the tournament. So that kind of stuck out as like a memory, right? Like, and then later on, I was able to attend a couple of different U.S. Opens at Bethpage. So, it's kind of a special moment when you get a chance to be there for the final round of the U.S. Open and you're actually able to be on the 18th hole when the winner comes and wins the tournament. Well, I didn't even have Floyd make the cut for my replay, right? Now, I did get kind of a surprise winner with like, Gil Morgan ended up winning it. But how could I have had a chance to better recreate like Ray Floyd's finish? Well, I think that starts with thinking about like, what are you trying to recreate with tournament mode? And what you're trying to do with tournament mode is kind of get through those first few rounds and dwindle down to where the cuts have been made. And now, not only do I know who made the cut, but I also know now who is in those final group pairings. So one of the things that I could have done is I could have started with kind of this layout. And again, this would have played into an interesting storyline because you can see here, once again, there was Greg Norman at the top of the leaderboard at the end of the third round. Like, I could have had it set up where that was where I was. Now, Greg Norman, as you can see here, fell off after that final round. He was off the board there. So now that might have been hard to kind of play out. But it would have been really interesting to at least start with this and say, okay, well, what would this have looked like? And I would have had some of the key players there. I would have had Floyd. I would have had Bob Tway, who ended up having a decent round for me. Payne Stewart on the leaderboard, Ben Crenshaw, Bernhard Longer, Tom Watson. I have some big names in there. So I could have taken this and used this as kind of my guide for setting up the final pairings. I could have just said, what I'm trying to do with tournament mode is get to who is at the top of the leaderboard after the third round, and those are going to be my final groupings. Here's my final pairings right here. I could have also looked at the final round pairings and used this as a guide, right? Here, and this is again for people on YouTube, like my final pairings here for those listening to the podcast. Greg Norman at the end of the third round led at even par. Hal Sutton, Lee Trevino were +1, Bob Tway +2, and then Floyd, McCumber, Reed, Stewart, Watson, or Dennis Watson were all part of a group at +3. And then I had a few people, Clemens, Crenshaw, Longer, Scott Verplank, and Tom Watson all at +4. Now there's 14 total golfers here. I could have had a couple of these guys thought about maybe as like the emerging golfers, or maybe I could have looked at those final standings and said, well, who didn't really stick around at the end? Like, I don't say Tom Watson in here. on my final round. I don't see Scott Verplank on the final round. But, Bernhard Langer did make it. Clements fell off as well. So I could have made sure, and Crenshaw finished in there too. So I could have used that as a guide to say, who do I want to maybe not have part of that final round from that +4 grouping, just to make sure I had my 12. That could have been something I could have utilized. I could have even used some of this to say, okay, here's Chip Beck, who finished second or in a tie for second, and Lanny Watkins finished tied for second. Neither one of them was on that third round leaderboard. They could have been two good candidates to be my emerging golfers if I had that happen, right? So I could have used them as my emerging golfers as I recreated that. And then at least then I would have felt like I gave Floyd a chance to repeat as champion. Because he would have been in there. He would have been one of the, he would have been in not the first pairing, second, he would have been in my third pairing, more than likely. And I would have had a chance to kind of watch that storyline develop through the round. So that's certainly something that I could have done. I could have also used some of those game day chart results to help influence a little bit who's going to do what in this round. I could have given Floyd maybe some kind of a rating that would have said, hey, here's how he moved through the leaderboard here. For him to go from a +3 to a -1 in that final round and be the only one who finished under par, he probably had some luck, maybe had extra control. I could have worked with some of those ratings to give him a little bit of an edge there to also kind of, tilt it in his favor a little bit if I wanted to create that. How did Greg Norman go from leading at even par to finishing at +5? He had an awful round. Maybe he starts with a bunch of red chips. Maybe he had to add an extra quality or something, or maybe he lost a good quality that he had. Those could have been things that I could have utilized to help tell that story a little bit too. So while tournament mode is great, and I would highly recommend it if you want to play a tournament with History Maker Golf, it's a great mechanic to help you kind of dwindle down a field to those final pairings. I do think if you're trying to actually do a historical recreation, it's worth exploring what those other options can be. And a lot of times, to me, this is still playing within the rules of the game. This isn't really cheating the game at all. What's the objective? The objective is to get to 6 pairings that you're going to start with for your final round. Well, who's to determine what those pairings are? I can use tournament mode, or I can kind of tilt it in the favor of historical replays and say, here's the guys who actually would have been in those final pairings. The whole idea of game day charts is to give you some of those intangibles that maybe influence the way guys are going to perform. And that can play really well when you're trying to build storylines for your season using the tournament mode. But you could also utilize those to help you kind of tilt things in people's favor to try to see if you can get a recreation there of the historical events. Those are some of the ways that you can play with those a little bit. And, I go back to a couple years ago, we were doing a replay of the 1980 Winter Olympics. And I wanted to see Team USA beat Team Russia. Now, the card set that we were using didn't have them rated that much worse than Team Russia. I think that the overall team ratings were, the U.S. had won the gold. They were a pretty well-rated team. The Russians were also very good. But when I decided to replay that kind of matchup between the two and said, how am I going to get the U.S. to beat Russia here? One of the things that I did was, again, use the rules in Hockey Blast to play into my advantage. So I said, okay, well, this is obviously going to be home ice, so I'll make the U.S. the home team, even though this is a Olympics tournament. They were clearly the home team in Lake Placid. That was an easy one. But I also said, let's start them with a momentum chip. And that would give them an advantage at the beginning of the game. Like I would, give them a momentum chip at the start of the game. Now, is that bending the rules a little bit? Yes, it is, but it helps tell kind of a storyline there that, I said I was using it. It's like, hey, you know what? They just had this great like locker room speech from, Herb, and Herb Brooks like gives them a great speech in the locker room, as we all saw in the movie. Team's energized, starting off the game. Let's give them a chip. And it did help. It helped them a little bit just to get them some momentum in those first couple of pairings to make sure that they had a chance coming out of the gate to get out in front of the Russians. Bending the rules a little bit, but still playing within what I think are the mechanics of the game and not really trying to homebrew too much. But if I was going to replay a golf tournament in the future, I think this is the approach that I'll probably take, is to say, let's look at the historical ratings. Let's try to think about who I want to have in those final pairings. And then maybe think about, like, what do the final results tell me about how some of these guys perform? And maybe I can tilt some things in the favor of recreating that storyline a little bit too. So that's one thing that I think in retrospective I would definitely think about changing. But overall, really satisfied with the project. I think it was the right size for the project for me, was to keep it to about 10 events. I don't think replaying an entire season would have been something I would have really enjoyed as much. But, for some people, that's exactly what they want to do. For me, golf wasn't something I wanted to do, was replay the entire one. So, but again, like I think like thinking about the courses that we would want, and would even love to see Play do that, right? Like I would love to see them when they come out with some of these historical sets say, here's the courses that you would want to use. And if they don't have them, either like recommend like who, maybe there are some like, fan created ones, right? Like community created courses that they could recommend. I would love to see that kind of an approach for future releases for historical seasons, so that somebody could easily say, okay, this is the schedule that I want to replay then. That would be pretty cool. Okay, so that's a wrap on this week's episode. As always, if you'd like to help support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/Tabletop SportCast. $1 a month goes a long way to helping to offset costs for the podcast. They've increased a little bit for me, so wouldn't mind having a little bit more support, but, I am grateful for all those who are supporting the podcast already. As I mentioned, this is probably going to be one of the first ones. I'm going to try to post this on YouTube, so fingers crossed that works. But this should get posted to YouTube later today, as well as all of the streamings that I usually do for the podcast. Next episode, we're going to be taking an inside look at the Highlight Maker Hoops Primetime. This is the full play version that came out from Play. Had intended on doing that recently, just didn't work out the schedule, so we'll catch up and do an inside look at Primetime, the latest release from Play Games, and their newest version for the full play of basketball. So we'll take a look at Primetime next week. Until then, thanks for listening.